Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her forehead as she hung the last piece of laundry on the line behind her small cabin. The hot Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, and her swollen belly made every movement difficult. At 8 months pregnant, she could barely manage the daily chores. But her husband Thomas expected everything to be perfect when he returned from his cattle drives. The sound of hoofbeats made her heart race with fear. Thomas was back early, and from the heavy way his boots hit the wooden porch, she knew he was angry about something. She quickly smoothed her dress and tried to look busy, knowing that any sign of laziness would result in harsh words or worse. "Sarah," Thomas bellowed from inside the house. "Where's my supper? I've been riding all day and come home to nothing." She hurried inside, her hands shaking as she tried to explain that she had been preparing to cook when he arrived. But Thomas was already reaching for his belt, his face red with rage. He had been drinking again. She could smell it on his breath. "You're worthless," he snarled, grabbing her roughly by the arm. "Can't even manage simple housework. What good are you?" Sarah tried to protect her belly as he shoved her toward the kitchen. She had learned long ago not to fight back, as it only made things worse. The neighbors lived too far away to hear her cries, and even if they did, most people believed a man had the right to discipline his wife as he saw fit. As she prepared his meal with trembling hands, Sarah thought about her life before marriage. She had been a school teacher in Philadelphia, independent and educated. But when her parents died and left her with debts, Thomas had seemed like salvation. He promised her a new life in the Arizona territory, a chance to start fresh. Instead, she had found herself trapped in a nightmare. Thomas controlled every aspect of her life. He decided when she could leave the house, who she could talk to, and how she should spend her days. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and she had no horse of her own. She was completely isolated, dependent on a man who seemed to hate her more each day. The pregnancy had made things even worse. Thomas seemed angry that she was carrying his child as if it was somehow her fault alone. He complained constantly about the extra expense, about how she was even more useless now that she tired easily. That night, as Thomas snored loudly beside her, Sarah placed her hands on her belly and whispered to her unborn child. "I'll protect you somehow," she promised. "I won't let him hurt you the way he hurts me." But deep down she wondered how she could keep that promise when she couldn't even protect herself. The baby kicked strongly as if responding to her words, and Sarah felt a tear slide down her cheek. She had never felt so alone and hopeless in her entire life. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their voices carrying across the desert like a mournful song. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine a different life, one where she and her child could be free. But freedom seemed as distant as the stars that twinkled coldly in the vast Arizona sky. The next morning brought no relief. Thomas left before dawn without saying goodbye, heading out for another cattle drive that would keep him away for several days. Sarah should have felt relieved, but instead she felt more trapped than ever. What if the baby came while he was gone? What if something went wrong? She was completely alone with no one to help her. As she went about her daily chores, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever. She just didn't know if it would be for better or worse. 3 days later, the pain started just before dawn. Sarah woke to sharp cramps that took her breath away. She had been through false alarms before, but this felt different. The contractions came in waves, growing stronger and closer together with each passing hour. By midday, she knew the baby was coming. Thomas was still away on his cattle drive, and she was completely alone. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and she had no way to send for help. Panic rose in her throat as she realized she would have to deliver this baby by herself. Sarah had helped her mother birth her younger siblings back in Philadelphia, so she wasn't completely ignorant about childbirth. But doing it alone without any assistance or medical help terrified her. She gathered clean towels and boiled water, trying to prepare as best she could while fighting through the increasing pain. The labor lasted 18 hours. Sarah bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, knowing that her cries would only attract wild animals. She paced the small cabin when she could, gripped the bedpost during contractions, and prayed constantly for strength to survive. When her son finally arrived just after midnight, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and overwhelming love. The baby was small but healthy, with a powerful cry that filled the quiet cabin. She cleaned him carefully and wrapped him in soft blankets she had sewn during her pregnancy. But her relief was short-lived. Within hours of the birth, Sarah developed a high fever. Her body shook with chills and she could barely keep her eyes open. She knew something was seriously wrong, but there was nothing she could do, except try to care for her newborn son while fighting for her own life. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. The baby cried constantly, hungry and needing attention she could barely provide. Sarah forced herself to nurse him when she could, but her strength was fading fast. She began to fear that they would both die in this isolated cabin, and no one would find them for weeks. On the 4th day after the birth, Thomas finally returned. But instead of showing concern for his wife's condition or joy at meeting his son, he flew into a rage. The house was a mess, there was no food prepared, and Sarah looked terrible. "Look at this place," he shouted, kicking over a chair. "You can't even keep house properly when you're laying around doing nothing." Sarah tried to explain about the difficult birth and her fever, but Thomas wasn't listening. He seemed angry that the baby had arrived while he was away, as if she had planned it deliberately to inconvenience him. "I should have been here," he muttered, but not out of concern. "Now I'll have everyone asking questions about where I was when my son was born." When Sarah collapsed while trying to prepare his dinner, Thomas's anger reached a dangerous level. He accused her of faking illness to get out of work, of being lazy and worthless. The baby's constant crying only made him angrier. That night, while Sarah lay delirious with fever, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't handle a sick wife and a crying baby. In his twisted mind, he convinced himself that Sarah was deliberately making herself sick to manipulate him. The next morning, he dragged the weak and protesting Sarah to the small root cellar behind the house. Despite her pleas and the baby's cries, he forced heavy iron shackles around her ankles, chains he had originally used for securing cattle during transport. "You'll stay down here until you learn to be a proper wife," he declared coldly. "Maybe some time alone will cure your lazy ways." He left her there in the dark, damp cellar with only a thin blanket and her hungry baby. The chains were heavy and cut into her skin, making it impossible to move more than a few feet. The cellar had no windows and only a heavy wooden door that Thomas secured with a thick bar. Sarah held her baby close and wept silently in the darkness. She had thought her situation couldn't get worse, but Thomas had proven her wrong. Now she was not just isolated and abused, but literally imprisoned. And her innocent baby was trapped with her, paying the price for his father's cruelty. Days blended into nights in the suffocating darkness of the root cellar. Thomas brought food once a day, throwing down stale bread and water like she was an animal. He refused to remove the chains, claiming she needed to learn her place. The baby grew weaker and Sarah's milk began to dry up from stress and poor nutrition. The cellar was cold and damp, with earthen walls that wept moisture. Sarah's thin nightgown provided little protection against the chill, and she wrapped her baby in the single blanket Thomas had allowed her to keep. The chains around her ankles had worn raw wounds that became infected, making every movement agony. Thomas would sometimes stand at the top of the cellar steps and lecture her about being a proper wife. He blamed her for everything: the difficult birth, the baby's crying, even the poor weather that had scattered some of his cattle. In his mind, chaining her up was reasonable punishment for her failures. "When you're ready to behave like a decent woman, you can come back up," he would say before slamming the door shut again. Sarah tried to stay strong for her baby, but she could feel her body failing. The infection from the chains was spreading, and she had developed a persistent cough from the damp conditions. She began to fear that her son would die in this horrible place, and the guilt was almost worse than the physical pain. On the 10th day of her imprisonment, Sarah heard something unusual. Footsteps above, but lighter than Thomas's heavy boots. Then voices. Thomas was talking to someone. Her heart raced with hope. Maybe someone had come looking for them. Maybe this nightmare would finally end, but the voices faded and whoever had visited was gone within an hour. Thomas didn't come down to the cellar that day at all, leaving Sarah and the baby without even the meager food he usually provided. The baby's crying had become weaker, more of a whimper than a proper cry. Sarah knew he was slowly starving, and she was powerless to help him. She sang lullabies through her tears, trying to comfort him even as her own strength ebbed away. It was on the 12th day that she first heard different footsteps above. Someone was walking around the house, but the steps were careful, almost silent. Thomas's boots always announced his presence long before he reached the door. These steps belonged to someone else. Sarah held her breath, afraid to hope. The footsteps moved around the house several times as if someone was looking for something. Then they stopped directly above the cellar door. She heard the scraping sound of the wooden bar being lifted away from the door. Sarah's heart pounded as she clutched her baby closer. What if it was one of Thomas's friends? What if this person was even worse than her husband? The door creaked open, letting in the first natural light Sarah had seen in nearly 2 weeks. She blinked painfully as her eyes adjusted, barely able to make out a silhouette against the brightness above. "Ma'am?" a voice called softly. "Are you down there?" It was a man's voice, but gentle and concerned, nothing like Thomas's harsh tone. Sarah tried to answer but could only manage a weak croak. Her throat was raw from the damp air and dehydration. The man climbed partway down the rough wooden steps and Sarah could finally see him clearly. He was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. His skin was bronzed from the sun, his long black hair pulled back and secured with a leather cord. His clothes were a mixture of traditional Apache garments and frontier clothing, buckskin pants, a cotton shirt, and high moccasins. But it was his eyes that struck her most. They were dark and intelligent, filled with genuine concern as he took in her horrible condition. When he saw the chains around her ankles and the infected wounds, his expression hardened with anger. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his English clear despite a slight accent. Sarah tried to speak but could only point upward toward the house. The stranger's face grew grim as he understood. He looked at the baby in her arms, noting how thin and pale the child had become. "We need to get you both out of here," he said firmly. "Can you climb?" Sarah shook her head weakly, rattling the chains. The man examined the shackles, his jaw clenched with fury at the cruelty he was witnessing. He pulled a set of tools from his belt and began working on the locks, his movements quick and efficient. "My name is Joseph," he said as he worked. "I'm going to help you." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a spark of hope. Joseph worked quickly but carefully on the shackles, his strong hands surprisingly gentle as he avoided Sarah's infected wounds. The chains finally fell away with a metallic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the small space. Sarah gasped with relief, but when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. "Easy," Joseph said, catching her before she could fall. "You've been chained up too long. Your body needs time to remember how to work." He helped her sit on the steps, then examined the baby with experienced eyes. Joseph had delivered many foals and calves in his time, and he could see that the infant was dangerously thin and weak. "When did he last eat?" Joseph asked. "Yesterday morning, maybe." Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't have enough milk anymore." Joseph nodded grimly. He had a mare back at his camp that had recently lost her foal. Mare's milk could sustain a human baby in emergencies, and this was certainly an emergency. "We need to leave now," he said. "Can you hold him while I carry you?" Sarah nodded, clutching her son protectively. Joseph lifted them both with surprising ease, carrying them up out of the cellar into the blazing Arizona sunlight. Sarah had to close her eyes against the brightness, but she had never been so grateful to feel warm sun on her face. Joseph's horse waited nearby, a beautiful spotted mare that stood perfectly still as he approached. With practiced movements, he secured Sarah and the baby on the horse's back, then mounted behind them to provide support. "Where are we going?" Sarah managed to ask as they rode away from the cabin. "Somewhere safe," Joseph replied. "Your husband is in town drinking and bragging about how he's taught his wife a lesson. He won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm sun. Thomas would be furious when he found them gone. Men like him didn't let their property escape easily, and in his mind that's all she was. Property. Joseph's camp was hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees near a small stream. It was simple but comfortable, with a shelter made of branches and canvas and a fire ring surrounded by smooth stones. Most importantly, it had fresh, clean water and the mare Joseph had mentioned. He helped Sarah down from the horse and settled her in the shade, then immediately began heating water over the fire. From various pouches and bundles, he produced herbs and clean cloth for treating her wounds. "You know medicine?" Sarah asked, watching him work with confident efficiency. "My grandmother taught me," Joseph explained. "Apache women are skilled healers. I learned from the best." As he cleaned and bandaged her infected ankle wounds, Sarah studied her rescuer more closely. Joseph looked to be in his 30s with the lean, strong build of someone who lived an active outdoor life. His movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no energy or motion. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Joseph paused in his work, meeting her eyes directly. No person should be chained like an animal, and no child should suffer for the cruelty of others. His simple words carried a conviction that touched Sarah deeply. After months of Thomas telling her she deserved his treatment, Joseph's automatic assumption of her humanity was overwhelming. The mare's milk proved to be exactly what the baby needed. Joseph showed Sarah how to feed the infant using a clean cloth soaked in the warm milk. Within hours, the baby's color improved and his cries grew stronger. "He's going to live," Joseph said with satisfaction, watching the baby nurse eagerly. Sarah wept with relief and gratitude. For weeks she had feared her son would die because of her inability to provide for him. Now this stranger had given them both a chance at life. As evening approached, Joseph prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew and flatbread. It was the first real food Sarah had eaten in nearly 2 weeks, and she had to eat slowly to avoid making herself sick. "You saved our lives," she said finally. Joseph shook his head. "You saved your own lives by surviving. I just opened a door." But Sarah knew it was more than that. Without Joseph's intervention, she and her baby would have died in that horrible cellar. Thomas would have eventually gone too far, and no one would have ever known what happened to them. "Thomas will come looking for us," she said, fear creeping into her voice. Joseph's expression grew serious. "I know, that's why we need to make a plan." That night, as Sarah slept peacefully for the first time in weeks with her baby safe in her arms, Joseph kept watch. He had dealt with violent men before and knew that Thomas would not simply accept the loss of his wife and child. Men like Thomas saw their families as possessions, and they would go to great lengths to reclaim what they believed belonged to them. Joseph had been tracking stolen cattle when he first discovered Sarah's situation. He had approached the Mitchell cabin hoping to water his horse and ask about missing livestock, but Thomas's behavior had immediately raised suspicions. The man was nervous, defensive, and kept glancing toward the back of his property as if hiding something. When Thomas left for town that morning, Joseph had investigated further. The sound of a baby crying from beneath the ground had led him to the hidden cellar door. What he found there had filled him with a rage that still burned in his chest. As dawn approached, Joseph made his decision. Simply moving Sarah and the baby to another location wouldn't be enough. Thomas would track them down eventually, and next time he might kill them both rather than risk exposure of his crimes. When Sarah woke, Joseph was preparing to leave. He had packed supplies and was checking his weapons with the methodical care of someone preparing for trouble. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, struggling to sit up. Her body still ached terribly, but the rest and medical care had helped more than she had dared hope. "To end this properly," Joseph replied grimly, "Thomas will be returning to the cabin soon. When he finds you gone, he'll start hunting. I can't let that happen." Sarah felt a stab of fear. "You can't face him alone. He has guns and he's dangerous when he's angry." Joseph smiled slightly, the expression not reaching his eyes. "I'm Apache, Mrs. Mitchell. We know something about being dangerous." But Sarah wasn't comforted by his confidence. She had seen what Thomas was capable of when he felt threatened. The thought of Joseph risking his life for them was unbearable, especially after he had already done so much. "Please don't," she whispered. "We could just keep running. Find somewhere far away where he'll never find us." Joseph knelt beside her, his expression gentle but determined. "You've been running your whole marriage. Always afraid, always looking over your shoulder. That's no way to live, and it's no way to raise your son." He was right, and Sarah knew it. Even if they escaped Thomas this time, he would never stop looking for them. And there were other men like him everywhere, men who believed women and children were property to be controlled by force. "What will you do?" Sarah asked quietly. "What needs to be done?" Joseph replied. "But first I need to get you somewhere truly safe." He had already made arrangements with his cousin Maria, who lived with her family on a small ranch 20 miles north. Maria's husband Roberto was a former soldier who understood the need to protect women and children from violent men. They would welcome Sarah and the baby without questions. "Maria lost her own baby last spring," Joseph explained as he helped Sarah onto his horse. "She'll understand what you've been through, and she'll know how to care for your son." The ride to Maria's ranch was difficult for Sarah, but she endured it without complaint. Every mile they traveled was a mile further from Thomas and closer to real safety. Maria proved to be exactly what Joseph had promised. A kind, understanding woman who took one look at Sarah's condition and immediately set about providing care and comfort. She prepared a proper bed, heated water for bathing, and found clean clothes that would fit Sarah's thin frame. "You're safe now, Hermana," Maria said, using the Spanish word for sister. "No one will hurt you here." Roberto was equally welcoming, but Sarah could see the anger in his eyes when he noticed her healing ankle wounds and understood what they meant. Like Joseph, he was a man who believed in protecting the innocent. "This Thomas," Roberto said to Joseph when they thought Sarah couldn't hear, "he is the kind of man who gives all men a bad name." "Something must be done," Joseph nodded grimly. "Something will be done. But first make sure they're protected if anything happens to me." Roberto clasped Joseph's shoulder. "Nothing will happen to you, my friend. But yes, they will be protected always." That evening, as Sarah bathed her baby in warm water for the first time since his birth, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually be free. The baby gurgled happily in the warm water, his small hands reaching for the soap bubbles Maria had created for him. "He's getting stronger already," Maria observed with satisfaction. "Babies are tougher than we think." But even as Sarah enjoyed this moment of peace, she couldn't stop worrying about Joseph. He had hidden it well, but she had seen the deadly, serious expression in his eyes when he spoke about ending things with Thomas. Whatever he was planning, it was dangerous. "Please keep him safe," she whispered to whatever spirits might be listening. The Apache stranger had become her guardian angel, and she couldn't bear the thought of him being harmed because of her problems. Joseph returned to the Mitchell cabin just as Thomas was discovering the empty cellar. The man's roars of rage could be heard from half a mile away as he realized his wife and child were gone. He had torn through the house, breaking furniture and cursing, looking for clues about where they might have gone. From his hidden position in the rocks above the cabin, Joseph watched Thomas storm around the property like a madman. The man had been drinking heavily, which made him more dangerous but also more careless. Joseph could have killed him easily from that distance, but that wasn't the Apache way. This confrontation needed to happen face to face. Thomas had saddled his horse and was preparing to ride out searching when Joseph stepped into view. He walked calmly down the hillside, his rifle held loosely in one hand, showing no fear or urgency. "Looking for someone?" Joseph called out when he was still 30 yards away. Thomas spun around, his hand going immediately to his pistol. When he saw Joseph, his eyes narrowed with suspicion and rage. "Who the hell are you? And what do you know about my wife?" "I know you chained her in a cellar like an animal," Joseph replied, continuing his steady approach. "I know you left her and your baby to die in the dark." Thomas drew his pistol, pointing it at Joseph with shaking hands. "She's my wife. I'll discipline her however I see fit. Now where is she?" Joseph stopped walking, but he didn't raise his rifle or show any sign of fear. "She's somewhere you'll never find her. Somewhere she and the boy will be safe from you." "Like hell," Thomas snarled. "She belongs to me and so does that baby. I'll find them, and when I do, I'll make sure they never run again." It was exactly what Joseph had expected to hear. Men like Thomas never changed, never learned, never stopped being dangerous to those weaker than themselves. The only way to protect Sarah and her son was to remove the threat permanently. "No," Joseph said simply. "You won't." Thomas fired his pistol, but alcohol and rage had affected his aim. The bullet went wide, striking the ground near Joseph's feet. Joseph didn't even flinch. In one smooth motion, Joseph raised his rifle and fired. The shot took Thomas in the chest, dropping him instantly. The man's pistol fell from his hand as he collapsed beside his horse, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Joseph approached carefully, keeping his rifle ready, but Thomas was finished. The man who had terrorized Sarah for months was dead. His reign of cruelty ended forever. Looking down at the body, Joseph felt no satisfaction, only a grim sense of necessity. He had killed men in war and in defense of others, but he never enjoyed taking a life. This had been required to protect an innocent woman and child. Nothing more. Joseph searched the cabin thoroughly, taking anything that might be useful to Sarah. Her few personal possessions, some money Thomas had hidden, and documents that proved her marriage and her son's parentage. Legal proof might be important later if questions were asked. He buried Thomas in a shallow grave behind the cabin, marking it with a simple stone cairn. The man deserved no ceremony or mourning, but Joseph's Apache upbringing required respectful treatment of all dead, even enemies. Before leaving, Joseph scattered Thomas's cattle and released his horses. Let them run wild rather than become property of whoever might claim the abandoned ranch. He also left signs that would suggest Thomas had been killed by cattle rustlers, scattered belongings, evidence of a struggle, hoof prints of multiple horses. The story would be believable. Thomas Mitchell had been known as a difficult man who made enemies easily. His death at the hands of outlaws would surprise no one, and few would investigate very deeply. 2 days later, Joseph returned to Maria's ranch to find Sarah much improved. Good food, proper rest, and medical care had worked wonders. She was still thin and weak, but the dangerous pallor was gone, and her eyes held hope instead of despair. The baby had thrived under Maria's care. He had gained weight. His cries were strong and healthy, and he was beginning to focus on faces and respond to voices. Sarah was able to nurse him properly again, her body recovering from the trauma and malnutrition. "It's finished," Joseph told Sarah simply when they were alone. She didn't ask for details, but tears of relief rolled down her cheeks. After months of living in fear, the constant threat was finally gone. Her son would grow up free from his father's violence. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Joseph had been thinking about that question for days. Sarah was still legally married, but as far as the world knew, she was now a widow. She could make her own choices about the future for the first time in years. "That's up to you," he said. "You're free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want. The ranch will probably be sold to pay Thomas's debts, but there should be enough money left for you to start over somewhere else." Sarah looked around at Maria's warm, welcoming home, then back at Joseph. "What if I don't want to go somewhere else?" 6 months later, Sarah stood in the doorway of her new home, watching Joseph teach her son to ride on a gentle old mare. At barely 8 months old, little James was far too young for actual riding. But Joseph held him securely while the horse walked in slow circles around the corral. The baby's delighted laughter filled the air, a sound that still amazed Sarah after the dark early months of his life. The small house Joseph had built for them sat on a beautiful piece of land near a stream, surrounded by cottonwood trees and rolling hills. It was nothing like the isolated, threatening cabin where she had been imprisoned. This home was filled with light and warmth, a place where love could grow. Sarah had officially become a widow when news of Thomas's death reached the territorial authorities. The story of cattle rustlers killing him during a robbery was accepted without question. No one investigated very deeply, and no one seemed particularly sorry to see Thomas Mitchell gone. Maria had helped Sarah through the difficult early weeks of recovery, both physical and emotional. The two women had become close friends, almost sisters, bonded by their shared understanding of loss and survival. Maria's ranch was only an hour's ride away, close enough for regular visits but far enough to give Sarah the independence she craved. Joseph had courted her slowly and carefully, understanding that she needed time to heal from Thomas's abuse. He never pushed or demanded anything, never raised his voice or showed anger in her presence. Instead, he showed her what a man could be when he truly cared for a woman's well-being. He brought her wildflowers from the desert, taught her to identify edible plants and healing herbs, and shared stories of Apache culture and traditions. Most importantly, he treated her as an equal partner rather than property to be controlled. When Sarah finally felt ready to accept his proposal of marriage, it had been her choice entirely. Joseph had made it clear that she could stay on the land and live independently, whether she married him or not. He would protect and provide for her and James regardless of her decision. Their wedding had been a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher, with Maria and Roberto as witnesses. Sarah wore a beautiful white dress that Maria had helped her sew, and Joseph wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with frontier attire. It was everything her first wedding had not been, a celebration of love rather than a transaction. James had taken to Joseph immediately, seeming to recognize the gentleness and strength in his new father. Joseph treated the boy as his own son, teaching him Apache words along with English, showing him how to read animal tracks and weather signs. "He'll grow up knowing both worlds," Joseph had told Sarah, "the best of Apache wisdom and the best of what white society offers. He'll be stronger for it." Sarah's own education had not gone to waste either. She had started a small school in their home, teaching the children of neighboring ranches and even some Apache children from Joseph's extended family. Her lessons included both traditional subjects and practical skills like reading the land and understanding nature. The money from selling Thomas's ranch had provided them with a comfortable start, but it was their combined efforts that made their new life truly prosperous. Joseph's knowledge of the land and Sarah's organizational skills created a successful small ranch that specialized in raising horses. As evening approached, Joseph carried James into the house while Sarah prepared dinner. The baby had grown strong and healthy, his early trauma leaving no lasting physical effects. He was a happy child, quick to smile and laugh, surrounded by love and security. "He's getting heavy," Joseph said with satisfaction, settling James in his wooden high chair. "Soon he'll be walking." Sarah smiled, watching her two men together. Sometimes she still couldn't believe how completely her life had changed. A year ago, she had been a prisoner, convinced she would die in that horrible cellar. Now she was surrounded by love, respect, and hope for the future. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Joseph quietly. "Giving up your freedom to take on a ready-made family." Joseph looked at her with surprise. "Regret loving you? Regret having James as my son?" "Never." He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "You didn't trap me, Sarah. You freed me too. I was alone, wandering, never belonging anywhere completely. Now I have a home, a family, a reason to build something lasting." That night, after James was asleep in his cradle, Sarah and Joseph sat on their porch watching the stars. The same stars that had seemed so cold and distant during her darkest hours now looked warm and welcoming, full of promise for the future. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, "for seeing that we were worth saving." Joseph pulled her closer, his arms strong and protective around her shoulders. "You saved yourselves by having the courage to survive. I just had the privilege of helping you find freedom." In the distance, coyotes howled their ancient songs, but the sound no longer seemed mournful to Sarah. Now it sounded like a celebration of wild things living free under the vast Arizona sky. Just like her family, who had found their way from chains and darkness into light and love. James stirred in his sleep and made a soft sound, dreaming whatever dreams happy babies have. Sarah smiled, knowing her son would grow up never knowing fear or chains, surrounded by people who would protect and cherish him. It was more than she had ever dared hope for during those dark days of imprisonment. The Apache stranger had indeed set them free. But more than that, he had given them a new beginning filled with endless possibilities.